Good evening. And tonight, we travel slowly back through time. Back nearly 800 years. To the cold stone towns and towering castles of medieval Europe. If you're listening while lying comfortably in bed, you might want to take a slow breath and let your mind drift gently into the past. Imagine a quiet evening in a medieval town. The narrow streets are dimly lit by flickering torches. Most people have already gone home. The market stalls are empty, and the only sounds that remain are the soft clatter of a horse's hooves and the distant creak of wooden doors closing for the night. But somewhere in the town square, something unpleasant is happening. A small group of guards is dragging a man across the cobblestones. His wrists are tied with thick rope, and although the townspeople pretend not to notice, they know exactly where he is going. He is going to the castle dungeon. And once someone enters a medieval prison, there is a very real chance they may never come out again. Now today, when we think about prisons, we usually imagine buildings with cells, beds, meals, and rules. But medieval prisons were nothing like that. In fact, most medieval prisons were never designed to hold people for long periods of time. They were meant to be temporary holding places. A place where someone waited for punishment, or trial, or sometimes execution. But the reality was far worse. Because many prisoners were forgotten. Some waited months, some waited years, and some simply disappeared into the darkness. To understand why medieval imprisonment could be worse than death, we first need to understand the world of the medieval castle. High on a hill above the town stands the Lord's castle. It is massive. Tall gray walls rise into the cloudy sky. The stone towers seem almost endless. And inside those walls lives the Lord, his family, his soldiers, and the people who serve them. From the outside, castles look powerful and magnificent. But hidden beneath them, far below the warm halls and grand chambers, is a very different place. The dungeon. The word dungeon might make you imagine rows of cells with iron bars. But most medieval dungeons were far more primitive. Often they were nothing more than deep stone rooms buried underground. Some had no windows. Some had only a single wooden door. And some were simply pits in the ground. Yes, in many castles, prisoners were literally lowered into a hole. Once inside, there was no easy way out. These prison pits were sometimes called oubliettes. The word comes from an old French term meaning to forget, and that name was disturbingly accurate, because people thrown into an oubliette were often forgotten completely. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these pits. A narrow stone opening, barely wide enough for a person. When you peer down into the darkness, you cannot see the bottom. A guard lowers a rope, and the prisoner is forced down into the darkness. Then the rope is pulled back up, and the heavy stone lid is closed. Silence returns. And just like that, the world above disappears. Inside the dungeon, time begins to lose its meaning. There is no sunlight, no clock, no sense of morning or night. The air is cold and damp. Water drips slowly from the stone ceiling, and the smell is something most people today would find unbearable. Remember, these underground cells rarely had toilets, or fresh air, or cleaning. Over time, the dungeon floor would become covered with filth, mud, rotting straw, and sometimes worse. Yet the physical discomfort was only the beginning. The real horror of medieval imprisonment was uncertainty. A prisoner often had no idea what would happen next. Would they face trial? Would they be released? Would they be tortured? Or would they simply be left there until time itself ended their suffering? Even powerful people could end up in these prisons. Knights, nobles, and even rivals of the king. One famous prisoner was held for over 25 years. Another nobleman was imprisoned for so long that when he was finally released, he could barely walk. His body had forgotten how. But for most prisoners, Release never came. Food was minimal. Sometimes only a small piece of bread. And a cup of water. Just enough to keep someone alive. But not enough to give them strength. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks blurred into months. And in the endless darkness, many prisoners slowly lost their sense of reality. Some talked to themselves. Some sang quietly to stay sane. And some simply sat in silence, listening to the dripping water echo through the stone. Above them, life in the castle continued normally. Feasts were held in the great hall. Music played. Knights told stories beside warm fires. But far below their feet, someone might be sitting alone in the darkness, wondering if the outside world even remembered they existed. And perhaps the most terrifying part of all was that sometimes no one did, because medieval record keeping was often poor. If a lord died, or a war began, or the castle changed owners, prisoners could easily be forgotten entirely. Years later, when workers opened an old dungeon, they sometimes discovered skeletons still sitting against the wall. Silent reminders of people who had once waited for freedom that never arrived. So while execution was swift, and sometimes even considered merciful, a slow life inside a medieval prison could feel far worse than death. But the dungeon itself was only one small part of the terrifying medieval justice system, because the journey that brought someone to this place could be just as cruel, and in some cases, even stranger. In the next part of our story, we'll gently explore how people were arrested in medieval times, and the surprising reasons someone could end up inside a castle dungeon. For now, let the image of the quiet castle fade slowly from your mind. The torches flicker softly along the stone walls, and somewhere far below, a lonely prisoner listens to the steady drip of water, waiting for something that may never come. Now, as we slowly continue our quiet journey into the medieval world, let us gently step back above the dungeon, back into the cool evening air of the medieval town. The castle walls still loom high above the rooftops. Torches flicker softly along the gate, and the townspeople move carefully through the narrow streets. Because in the medieval world, freedom could disappear much faster than you might imagine. Today, when someone is arrested, there are usually clear laws, official procedures, and legal rights. But hundreds of years ago, things worked very differently. In many medieval towns, the local lord or ruler held almost complete authority. He decided the rules. He enforced the rules. And in many cases, he also judged whether someone was guilty. This meant that the path to prison could sometimes be very strange and surprisingly easy. Imagine you are a simple villager living in a small farming community. Your days are usually quiet. You wake up early. You work in the fields. You tend animals, repair tools, and try to survive another season. Life is hard, but predictable. But one small mistake, or even one accusation, could suddenly change everything. One of the most common reasons people ended up in prison was debt. If someone borrowed money or grain and failed to repay it, they could be arrested. Even small debts could cause serious trouble. Sometimes a farmer might borrow grain during a poor harvest. But if the next harvest also failed, the debt could grow. Eventually, the local lord might order the debtor to be imprisoned until payment was made. Of course, a prisoner locked inside a dungeon had almost no way to earn money, which meant the debt often remained unpaid, and the imprisonment could last much longer than expected. But debt was only one reason. Another very common cause was disputes between neighbors. Medieval villages were small places. Everyone knew everyone, and disagreements could quickly turn serious. A fight over land, a stolen chicken, an argument at the market. These small conflicts sometimes escalated into accusations of theft or violence. Without modern police investigations, the truth was not always easy to determine. Sometimes the loudest voice, or the most powerful family, won the argument, and the unlucky person on the losing side might find themselves dragged to the castle for questioning. In some cases, even rumors could lead to arrest. If someone was believed to practice forbidden magic, or if a traveler behaved strangely, suspicion could spread quickly through the village. Fear and superstition were powerful forces during medieval times. People often believed that illness, storms, or bad harvests could be caused by unseen supernatural powers. If something unfortunate happened, someone might be blamed, and that person could be taken away for questioning. For the accused, this moment could be terrifying. Imagine walking through the market, when suddenly two guards approach you. They wear heavy leather armor. Swords hang from their belts. One of them reads a short order from the Lord's steward. You are to come with them. Immediately, the crowd begins to whisper. People stare. Some step aside quietly. Others watch with curiosity. You may not even know exactly what you are accused of, but the guards do not explain much. They simply lead you through the town, toward the towering gates of the castle. Once inside the castle walls, the atmosphere changes. The cheerful noise of the marketplace fades behind you. Stone corridors echo with the sound of footsteps. Torches burn along the walls. And somewhere deeper inside the castle, a door creaks open. Sometimes prisoners were questioned immediately. Other times, they were simply placed in a cell to wait. Waiting was a very common part of medieval justice. Trials were not always quick. Judges might travel between towns. Important nobles might be busy with war or politics. And in many places, legal procedures were slow and unpredictable. This meant prisoners sometimes waited weeks, or even months, before anyone seriously reviewed their case. During this waiting period, the prisoner remained locked in the dungeon, with very little information about what would happen next. But the uncertainty did not end there, because medieval law often relied on something very different from modern evidence. Instead of detailed investigations, many courts used something called trial by ordeal. This was a strange and frightening method of deciding guilt or innocence. People believed that God would reveal the truth through physical tests. For example, one common ordeal involved hot iron. The accused person was required to carry a piece of glowing iron in their hands. After several days, the wound would be examined. If it healed cleanly, the person was declared innocent. But if the wound showed infection, it was taken as proof of guilt. Another ordeal involved boiling water. The accused might have to reach into a pot of boiling water to retrieve an object. Again, the healing of the wound was used to judge the result. To modern listeners, this method may seem strange and unfair, but at the time, many people truly believed divine power would protect the innocent. Still, for the prisoner waiting in the dungeon, these trials could be deeply frightening. Days would pass slowly in the darkness. The prisoner might hear guards talking above the dungeon stairs. Sometimes they heard footsteps approaching, only to fade away again. Food might arrive once a day. Perhaps a piece of bread. Perhaps thin soup. And always, the waiting continued. Meanwhile, life outside the prison moved on. The markets opened each morning. Farmers returned to their fields. Children played along the village paths. But for the person locked beneath the castle, time felt completely different. Hours stretched endlessly. The silence of the dungeon pressed in from every side. Sometimes prisoners tried to keep track of days. They scratched marks into the stone walls, or counted the times food arrived. But eventually, even those small attempts at order became difficult. The darkness erased the rhythm of time, and slowly, the prisoner began to feel disconnected from the world above. But even worse than the waiting was what sometimes came next, because medieval interrogations could be harsh. Very harsh. Authorities believed that strong pressure could reveal the truth, And unfortunately, that pressure sometimes included torture. But torture was not always used immediately. Often it was threatened first. Guards might describe the instruments waiting in another chamber. The prisoner might hear distant screams echo through the castle corridors. These sounds were meant to create fear. And sometimes, fear alone was enough to force a confession. Whether that confession was true or not. But those darker parts of medieval prisons are stories we will approach very slowly and gently. Because the world of medieval punishment was filled with strange devices and unsettling ideas about justice. So in the next part of our quiet historical journey, we will carefully explore the methods medieval authorities used to question prisoners and the unusual beliefs that guided their decisions. For now, imagine the castle once more growing quiet as night falls. The torches burn lower. The guards grow sleepy. And deep beneath the stone floors, a prisoner sits alone in the darkness, listening, waiting, and wondering what tomorrow might bring. Now, let us gently return once more to the quiet stone corridors beneath the castle. Above ground, the medieval world continues its slow rhythm. Merchants open their stalls. Farmers guide their oxen through muddy fields. Bells ring softly from distant church towers. But far below the busy life of the town, the dungeon remains still, dark, and almost completely silent. For the prisoner sitting in that underground chamber, each new day begins almost exactly like the one before it. Although, of course, the prisoner cannot actually see the sunrise. There are no windows in most dungeon cells, no warm golden light creeping across the floor. Instead, the prisoner wakes in darkness. Cold stone walls press in on every side. The air is heavy and damp. Sometimes a thin layer of mist gathers near the floor. The only reliable sign that time has passed is the sound of footsteps on the stairs above. Eventually a guard appears. His torchlight flickers across the walls as he unlocks the heavy door. He may not speak much. Perhaps he slides a wooden bowl across the floor. Inside it is something simple. A piece of bread, a few vegetables, or thin soup made from whatever ingredients were available in the castle kitchen. This is usually the only meal of the day, not because the guards want prisoners to starve, but because medieval castles had limited supplies. Food had to feed soldiers, servants, nobles, and travelers. Prisoners were rarely considered a high priority, and so meals were small, sometimes very small. Yet food was not the only challenge inside the dungeon. The environment itself was deeply uncomfortable. Most medieval prisons had no beds, no chairs, and no blankets. Instead, prisoners often slept directly on the floor. Sometimes there was a small pile of straw, but even that straw quickly became damp and dirty. Remember, the dungeon was underground. Rainwater often seeped through the stone walls. In winter the cold crept deep into the chamber. And during wet seasons, the floor could become muddy. Over time the prisoner's clothing became worn and filthy. Shoes fell apart. Fabric tore. And with little opportunity to wash, the prisoner slowly became part of the unpleasant environment around them. But physical discomfort was only part of the experience. Perhaps the hardest challenge was loneliness. Many dungeon prisoners were kept alone. No companions. No conversation. No visitors. Just endless quiet. At first a prisoner might try to stay hopeful. They might think about their home, their family, their village. They might imagine the moment when the dungeon door finally opens and someone announces their release. But as the days stretch into weeks, hope can become fragile. The mind begins to wander. Some prisoners talked quietly to themselves. Others sang songs they remembered from childhood. A few scratched drawings into the stone walls. These small actions helped pass the time. And sometimes, they helped a person remember who they were. Because long isolation can slowly blur a person's sense of identity. Without conversation, without sunlight, without normal routines, The mind struggles to hold on to reality. Even the smallest sound becomes important. The drip of water from the ceiling. The scratching of a rat behind the wall. The distant footsteps of guards changing shifts. These noises break the silence and remind the prisoner that the world still exists beyond the dungeon walls. Rats were very common in medieval prisons. They lived in the dark tunnels beneath castles. They searched constantly for scraps of food. Sometimes prisoners shared their tiny meals with these creatures. Not because they liked them, but because the rats were living companions in an otherwise empty place. Strange friendships formed in these silent chambers. Meanwhile, above the dungeon, life inside the castle followed a completely different rhythm. The lord and his family dined in the great hall. Long wooden tables were filled with roasted meat, bread, and wine. Musicians sometimes played gentle melodies during feasts. Servants moved quickly through the room carrying trays and jugs. Laughter echoed beneath the high wooden beams. If someone mentioned the prisoners below, it was usually only in passing. After all, prisons were simply part of the medieval justice system. They were not unusual. They were not shocking. They were simply accepted. And so the prisoners remained below. Mostly forgotten. But sometimes, a new sound would echo through the dungeon corridor. Heavy boots on the stone stairs. Voices speaking quietly. The jangle of metal keys. For the prisoner, this moment could bring both hope and fear. Because a visit from the guards could mean many things. Perhaps the prisoner would finally face trial. Perhaps a questioning session awaited. Or perhaps the Lord had made a decision about their fate. Sometimes prisoners were moved to different cells. Sometimes they were taken to the castle courtyard. And occasionally, they were released. But release was never guaranteed. In fact, many prisoners remained locked underground for extremely long periods. Especially if their case involved politics. Noble rivalries were common during medieval times. A powerful lord might imprison an enemy knight simply to remove him from power. As long as the prisoner remained locked away, he could not lead armies, influence politics, or challenge authority. This meant some prisoners were kept alive, but deliberately hidden. Years passed, and eventually the outside world forgot them. There are historical records describing prisoners who spent decades in confinement. When they were finally released, they were almost unrecognizable. Their hair had grown long and wild. Their skin had become pale from lack of sunlight. And their eyes struggled to adjust to the brightness of the outside world. Even walking could be difficult. After so many years in cramped spaces, the body had forgotten how to move freely. For these unfortunate individuals, freedom felt strange, almost unreal. But sadly, many prisoners never experienced that moment. Instead, their lives slowly faded away inside the quiet darkness of the dungeon. And sometimes, the only evidence they had ever existed was a name written long ago in a castle record. Yet despite all these hardships, the dungeon was not always the final stage of medieval punishment, because in some cases, authorities believed prisoners still needed to reveal the truth. And when confessions were not easily obtained, medieval interrogators turned to methods that were far more frightening. But those darker chapters of medieval justice are stories we will approach slowly and carefully, because they reveal a world where fear, belief, and power mix together in very unusual ways. So in the next part of our gentle historical journey, we will explore the strange interrogation chambers of medieval castles, and the curious devices that authorities believed could uncover hidden truths. For now, let your imagination slowly drift away from the dungeon once more. The torches grow dim. The castle grows quiet. And somewhere beneath the thick stone walls, a prisoner settles back against the cold floor, listening, waiting, and hoping that someday, the heavy door above the stairs will open again. Now, let us slowly return once again to the stone corridors beneath the castle. The dungeon is quiet tonight. Only the gentle flicker of torchlight moves across the rough walls. And somewhere in the distance, a guard walks slowly along the corridor. His boots echo softly against the stone floor. For many prisoners, days inside the dungeon pass in silence. But every so often, the heavy door opens, and a guard calls the prisoner's name. This moment could bring many different feelings. A small spark of hope, a quiet wave of fear, or simply confusion. Because when a prisoner was taken from the dungeon, they often did not know what would happen next. The guard might place iron shackles around the prisoner's wrists. Not always tightly, but firmly enough to prevent escape. Then the slow walk begins. Up the narrow staircase. Each step leads away from the darkness of the dungeon, but not necessarily toward freedom. Instead, the prisoner is usually brought to another chamber inside the castle. This room is often quieter than the busy halls above. The walls are thick stone. A wooden table stands in the center. A few chairs sit nearby, and perhaps a single narrow window lets in pale daylight. This is the interrogation chamber. Despite the frightening reputation these rooms sometimes had, many interrogations were actually simple conversations. A local judge or steward might sit at the table. He would ask questions about the crime. Where were you on that evening? Did you borrow the money? Did you strike your neighbor during the argument? These questions were written down by a clerk. Sometimes the answers were calm. Sometimes they were emotional. But the goal was simple: to understand what had happened. However, medieval justice also had another belief. Authorities often thought that guilty people would hide the truth, and if someone refused to confess, or if the evidence seemed unclear, the interrogation might become more serious. Before anything harsh happened, the officials often tried something simpler. They used intimidation. The prisoner might be shown instruments kept in another room. Heavy chains, iron restraints, strange wooden frames. The guards did not always use these devices immediately. Sometimes they only wanted the prisoner to see them, to imagine what they could do, because fear can be a powerful influence. Many prisoners confessed after simply hearing the description of these tools, even if they were innocent. Remember, most prisoners were already exhausted. They had spent weeks or months in darkness. They were hungry, cold, and frightened. Under those conditions, it was difficult to remain strong during questioning. But it is also important to remember something else. Not every medieval authority enjoyed cruelty. Many judges believed torture should only be used in very serious cases. For example, crimes involving treason against a king, or violent attacks. In smaller village disputes, punishments were often less extreme. Still, the possibility of harsh questioning remained part of the system, and that uncertainty added to the prisoner's fear. Imagine sitting in that interrogation chamber. The room smells faintly of smoke from nearby torches. A clerk dips his feather quill into ink. The judge looks up from the table, and the questions begin again. Where were you that night? Who witnessed the argument? Why did your neighbor accuse you? The prisoner answers carefully, trying to remember every detail, trying to explain their side of the story. Sometimes these conversations continued for hours. Then the prisoner might be returned to the dungeon to wait again. More days passed. More waiting. More wondering. And occasionally, something unexpected happened. A witness appeared. Someone from the village might come forward. Perhaps they saw the argument. Perhaps they heard the shouting. Perhaps they knew something that changed the entire case. Medieval courts relied heavily on witnesses. Unlike modern investigations with scientific evidence, most decisions depended on what people claimed to have seen, and human memory, as we know, can be imperfect. Still, if several witnesses supported the prisoner's story, the judge might begin to doubt the accusation. This could slowly change the direction of the case. But until a final decision was made, the prisoner returned once again to the dungeon, back to the quiet darkness, back to the long hours of waiting. For some prisoners, the waiting felt endless. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Yet eventually, most cases did reach a conclusion. The lord or judge would gather the available information: witness statements, confessions, rumors, and sometimes simply personal judgment. Then a decision would be announced. This moment could change everything. Some prisoners were released. Others were fined. Some were forced to perform labor. And a few faced much harsher punishments. But even when the final verdict approached, the prisoner inside the dungeon often remained unaware. They might sit quietly in the darkness, not realizing that somewhere above them, officials were discussing their future. The torchlight in the castle halls flickered late into the evening. Voices debated. Arguments continued. And eventually, a decision was made. But that decision, and the strange punishments that sometimes followed, are stories we will explore in the next part of our quiet historical journey. Because medieval justice did not always aim for simple imprisonment. In many cases, the punishment itself became a public event, a spectacle that the entire town gathered to watch. For now, let us leave the castle once again as night slowly settles across the countryside. The moon rises above the tall stone towers. The village grows silent. And deep below the castle floors, a prisoner rests against the cold wall of the dungeon, unaware that their fate may soon be decided. Now, let us slowly return once again to the quiet stone dungeon beneath the castle. Many days have passed, perhaps even many weeks, for the prisoner sitting in the darkness. Time has become difficult to measure. There is no sunrise to mark the morning, no sunset to signal the evening, only the occasional footsteps of guards, and the small wooden bowl of food that arrives once each day. But tonight, something feels slightly different. Footsteps echo more frequently along the corridor. Voices whisper beyond the thick wooden door. And somewhere above, a bell rings softly within the castle walls. For prisoners who had waited long enough, this sometimes meant that a decision had finally been made. Because medieval trials were rarely quick. Judges traveled slowly between towns. Witnesses needed time to arrive. And the lord of the castle might have many other matters demanding his attention. But eventually, the moment came when someone decided the prisoner's fate. And that decision usually arrived in a very simple way. The dungeon door opened. A guard stepped inside with a torch. And the prisoner's name was called. For a brief moment, hope might appear. Perhaps freedom had finally arrived. Perhaps the accusations had been cleared. But the prisoner would not know the truth yet. Instead, they were escorted slowly up the winding staircase, step by step, out of the damp darkness of the dungeon, and into the brighter stone halls of the castle. After so much time underground, even the small windows along the corridor could feel dazzling. Sunlight streamed faintly across the floor. Dust floated gently through the air. For many prisoners, this was the first glimpse of daylight they had seen in months. Eventually the guards guided the prisoner toward a larger chamber. This was often the great hall of the castle. A wide room with tall wooden beams and long tables. The lord of the castle might sit at the far end of the hall. Beside him stood advisors, soldiers, and clerks. Sometimes villagers gathered near the entrance as well. Medieval justice was often public. People were curious about the outcome. And punishments sometimes served as warnings for the entire community. The prisoner was brought forward, still tired, still wearing worn and dirty clothing from their long stay in the dungeon. Then the charges were read aloud. Perhaps it was theft, perhaps unpaid debt, perhaps a violent argument, or perhaps something more serious. The judge or lord listened once more to the final details. Witnesses might speak again. Clerks checked their written notes. And then, after all the waiting, the verdict was announced. Sometimes the result was surprisingly simple. If the accusations were weak, or the witnesses unreliable, the prisoner might be released. The guard removed the shackles. The prisoner was told they were free to go. For someone who had spent months underground, this moment must have felt almost unreal. To walk outside again. To feel sunlight. To breathe fresh air. But not every story ended this way. Many prisoners received other punishments instead. Fines were very common. The prisoner might owe money to the lord or to the person they had harmed. If they could not pay immediately, their families sometimes helped. In other cases, the prisoner might be ordered to perform labor, repairing roads, working in fields owned by the lord, or helping with construction inside the castle grounds. These punishments allowed the prisoner to repay their debt while remaining under supervision. Yet some crimes carried harsher consequences. For example, a thief might face public humiliation. In many towns there was a wooden device called the stocks. This structure held a person's hands and feet between heavy wooden boards. The prisoner sat in the town square while villagers passed by. People might laugh. Some might throw small pieces of fruit or vegetables. The punishment was uncomfortable, but its main purpose was embarrassment. Another device was the pillory. This held the head and hands in place. Again, it stood in public spaces so the community could witness the punishment. From a modern perspective, these punishments might seem strange. But medieval societies believed strongly in public justice. They wanted crimes to be seen, and consequences to be remembered. However, even these uncomfortable punishments could seem mild compared to one thing: returning to the dungeon. Because in some cases, the verdict did not bring release at all. Instead, the prisoner was sent back below the castle once again. Perhaps the fine had not been paid yet. Perhaps more investigation was required. Or perhaps the lord simply wished to keep the prisoner confined longer. And so, the heavy dungeon door closed once more. For the prisoner, this could be the most crushing moment of all. After finally leaving the darkness, after seeing the sky again, to return below ground could feel almost unbearable. Yet it happened more often than we might expect, especially when prisoners were involved in political conflicts. Rival nobles, disloyal knights, messengers accused of carrying secret information. These individuals could remain locked away for many years, hidden quietly beneath the castle, their existence known only to a few guards and officials. In these cases, imprisonment truly became a slow and uncertain fate. Not a quick punishment, but a long disappearance from the world above. And this is why many historians say that medieval imprisonment could sometimes feel worse than death. Because death was swift, but the dungeon was slow, silent, and endlessly uncertain. Yet even after all this time, even after years beneath the castle, some prisoners still held on to one quiet hope: the possibility that someday, the heavy door might open again, and a guard might say the words they had waited so long to hear. You are free. But that moment did not come for everyone. And in the final part of our journey tonight, we will explore what eventually happened to prisoners who remained forgotten beneath medieval castles. Because sometimes, long after wars ended, long after kings changed, people exploring ancient ruins discovered something unexpected deep within the old dungeons. Silent reminders of lives that had quietly vanished from history. Now, let us return once more to the quiet world beneath the medieval castle. The stone corridors are still. The torches burn slowly. And deep below the castle floor, the dungeon waits in silence. For many prisoners, time inside the dungeon lasted weeks. For others, months. But there were some unfortunate individuals whose imprisonment lasted far longer. Years passed above the castle walls. Kings came and went. Wars began and ended. Seasons changed again and again. Yet the prisoner remained in the same dark chamber beneath the stone. To understand how this could happen, we must remember how different medieval record-keeping was compared to today. Modern prisons maintain careful documents, names, dates, reasons for imprisonment. But during medieval times, records were often simple and incomplete. A clerk might write a prisoner's name in a ledger, perhaps a short description of the accusation, and sometimes nothing more. If that clerk left the castle, or if the lord who ordered the imprisonment died, those records could easily disappear. And when records disappeared, so did the prisoner. Imagine a man locked inside a castle dungeon during a time of political conflict. Perhaps he was a knight who supported the wrong noble family, or a messenger accused of carrying secret letters. The lord who imprisoned him might have believed the danger would pass quickly, so the prisoner was placed in the dungeon to wait. But then something unexpected happened. War broke out. The lord left the castle with his soldiers. Months passed. Battles were fought far away. And eventually, the lord never returned. A new ruler took control of the castle. The guards changed. The servants changed. Life continued. But somewhere in the deep dungeon corridors, a prisoner still sat in darkness, waiting. Perhaps he called out when he heard footsteps above. Perhaps he hoped someone would remember his case. But if the records were gone, and the guards knew nothing about him, his voice might echo only against the cold stone walls. Stories like this sound unbelievable. Yet historians studying medieval castles have found evidence that forgotten prisoners were real. Sometimes workers repairing ancient dungeons discovered small rooms sealed for centuries. Inside they found rusted chains, broken bowls, and occasionally, human remains. These discoveries remind us how uncertain life could be during those distant centuries. Even powerful individuals were not immune. In fact, some of the longest imprisonments in medieval history involved nobles. Political rivals were often captured rather than killed. Keeping someone alive in a dungeon could be a convenient way to remove them from power. One famous example from medieval Europe involved a nobleman who spent more than 20 years in confinement. When he was finally released, he struggled to recognize the world outside. Cities had grown. Children he once knew had become adults. And the life he remembered had almost completely disappeared. For prisoners like him, freedom felt both joyful and strange. Imagine stepping outside after decades underground. The sunlight would seem almost blinding. The sounds of the town would feel overwhelming. Birds singing, people talking, wagons rattling across the streets. All the simple noises of everyday life suddenly returning at once. Some former prisoners needed weeks to adjust to normal life again. Their bodies had grown weak, their eyes sensitive to light, their minds unused to conversation. But even with these challenges, freedom was still far better than the dungeon, because the dungeon offered almost nothing except waiting. And yet, there were still prisoners who never experienced release at all. Sometimes castles themselves were abandoned. This happened more often than we might imagine. During the medieval period, wars, fires, and economic decline sometimes forced nobles to leave their strongholds behind. If a castle was damaged during battle, its owners might move to a safer location. Servants packed their belongings. Soldiers marched away. And slowly, the once busy castle became empty. Windows broke. Roofs collapsed. Plants began growing through cracks in the stone. But beneath those ruins, the dungeon remained, hidden and silent. If a prisoner had been left below, their chances of rescue were very small. Over many years, the castle slowly transformed into a quiet ruin visited only by wind and wildlife. Centuries later, explorers or historians sometimes entered these forgotten structures. They walked through dusty halls. They examined broken towers. And occasionally, they descended into the old dungeon chambers. There they discovered the quiet evidence of the past. Chains attached to walls, rusty iron rings, and sometimes bones resting where a prisoner once sat. These discoveries can feel eerie, but they also remind us how much history has changed. Today, the ruins of medieval castles attract curious travelers. People walk through ancient courtyards with cameras. They admire the architecture. They imagine the knights and kings who once lived there. Yet very few visitors think about the silent lives that existed beneath those castles. The prisoners. The forgotten individuals who spent their final days waiting in darkness. But perhaps tonight, as we gently finish our quiet journey through medieval history, we can remember them for a moment. Not with fear, but with quiet curiosity about the past. Because history is not only made by kings and battles, it is also shaped by ordinary people, and sometimes by those whose stories were almost completely lost. The medieval world was a place of quiet contrasts. On the surface, it could appear beautiful. Across the countryside, tall stone castles stood proudly on hills. Their towers reached toward the sky. Their banners moved slowly in the wind. From far away, these castles looked almost peaceful. Villages gathered nearby. Farmers worked patiently in the surrounding fields. Horses pulled wooden carts along dusty roads. Church bells rang gently across the valleys. And life, at least from a distance, seemed calm. But beneath many of those castles, hidden below the thick stone foundations, there existed another world entirely. A darker world. A quieter one. A place where sunlight rarely reached. Down narrow staircases and through heavy wooden doors, cold air drifted through long, silent corridors. Torches flickered against damp walls. Their weak light danced slowly across the stone. Shadows stretched and shifted as the flames moved. And somewhere within that underground maze, behind iron bars or heavy doors, a prisoner once sat quietly, waiting, listening. The sound of water dripping from the ceiling echoed through the chamber. Drop after drop after drop. Time passed slowly in such places, sometimes so slowly that it felt almost frozen. The prisoner might lean back against the cold wall. Perhaps their hands rested loosely in their lap. Perhaps iron chains lay quietly nearby. Their eyes adjusted to the dim torchlight, and they listened carefully. For footsteps. For voices. For any sign that someone might be coming down the stone stairs. But many hours passed in silence, and the footsteps never arrived. Above them, life in the castle continued normally. Servants carried baskets through the kitchens. Soldiers stood guard along the walls. Nobles gathered in the great hall for evening meals. Music might even echo softly through the high wooden ceilings. Laughter. Conversation. The clinking of cups. None of those sounds reached the dungeon clearly. Down below, the prisoner heard only faint vibrations through the stone. Distant reminders that life continued somewhere far above. And so the hours passed. Then the night slowly settled across the countryside. Outside the castle walls, the villages became quiet. Farmers returned home after long days in the fields. Lanterns glowed softly in cottage windows. The wind moved gently across open farmland. Sometimes an owl called from the branches of a tall tree. The peaceful rhythm of the medieval countryside slowly prepared for sleep. But deep beneath the castle, the prisoner remained awake. Because sleep was not always easy in the dungeon. The stone floor was cold. The air was damp. And strange sounds echoed through the underground corridors. Rats sometimes moved along the edges of the walls. Water trickled quietly through unseen cracks. Every small noise seemed louder in the darkness. Yet over time, the prisoner became familiar with these sounds. The steady dripping of water became almost like a clock. The scratching of rats became ordinary. Even the distant footsteps of guards above slowly formed a pattern. Morning, afternoon, night. Without sunlight, these rhythms were the only way to measure passing time. And sometimes, during those long quiet hours, the prisoner's mind wandered far beyond the dungeon walls. They remembered their home village. They remembered fields filled with crops during summer. The smell of fresh bread from a bakery. The warmth of sunlight on a cool morning. Simple memories, but powerful ones. Because memory was often the only escape available inside a dungeon. Sometimes the prisoner imagined walking freely again, down a village road, past familiar houses, hearing friendly voices, seeing open skies. These thoughts helped them endure the endless waiting. Because waiting was the true nature of medieval imprisonment. It was not always constant punishment. It was not always dramatic suffering. More often, it was simply time. Long stretches of quiet time. Time spent sitting in darkness. Time spent wondering what the future might bring. Days blended together. Weeks passed unnoticed. And occasionally, hope flickered like the small torchlight in the corridor. Perhaps tomorrow someone would arrive. Perhaps a guard would unlock the door. Perhaps the prisoner would finally be called upstairs. But until that moment came, the dungeon remained quiet. The torches burned slowly, and the prisoner listened patiently to the steady drip of water echoing through the stone halls. For them, night and day were almost the same, just darkness, stillness, and the distant world continuing above. Time inside a dungeon did not move the way it did in the outside world. In villages and towns, people measured time through familiar rhythms: the rising sun, the midday bell, the slow arrival of evening shadows. But deep beneath the castle, those natural signals were absent. The prisoner could not see the sky. They could not watch clouds drifting overhead. And so time slowly became something softer, something harder to grasp. Instead of hours and days, there were only moments of quiet observation. The prisoner listened carefully to the small sounds of the dungeon: the gentle crackling of a torch, the distant clatter of metal somewhere along the corridor. Occasionally, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs would open. A guard's footsteps echoed down the stone steps. The sound traveled slowly through the underground passages. Each step seemed louder than the last. For the prisoner, those footsteps always brought a small moment of anticipation. Perhaps this time the guard would stop at their door. Perhaps the key would turn in the lock. Perhaps something new would happen. But often the footsteps simply passed by. The guard continued further down the corridor. Another prisoner might receive food or water. Another door might open briefly. And then silence returned once more. These small disappointments slowly became part of the prisoner's routine. Yet the human mind is remarkably adaptable. Even in a place as quiet and lonely as a medieval dungeon, people found ways to pass the endless hours. Some prisoners counted the drops of water falling from the ceiling. They watched each drop gather slowly, then fall into a small puddle below. Others traced patterns in the dust along the floor. Sometimes they carved tiny marks into the stone wall. One line for each day they believed had passed. Over time, those lines could grow into long rows of small scratches. A silent calendar carved into ancient stone. Years later, when historians explored abandoned castles, they sometimes discovered these markings. Quiet reminders of someone who once waited there. Someone who tried to keep track of time in a place where time almost disappeared. But not all prisoners remained completely alone. In some larger castles, dungeons held several small cells close together. Thick walls separated them. Yet faint voices could occasionally travel through the cracks. A prisoner might hear someone speaking softly in the next chamber. At first, the voice might seem strange, unfamiliar, but over time, it could become comforting. Even if the prisoners never saw each other, they might exchange quiet words through the wall. Simple conversations. Where are you from? How long have you been here? Do you remember what the outside world looks like? These small connections help people survive the loneliness. Because the hardest part of imprisonment was often not the hunger or the cold, but the feeling of being forgotten, knowing that life continued elsewhere, while you remained still, hidden beneath the castle. Yet despite these hardships, the medieval world was also full of strange stories of survival. There were prisoners who endured months in the dungeon and later returned to ordinary life. There were individuals who found unexpected kindness from guards. And there were even rare moments of escape. Of course, Escaping from a medieval dungeon was extremely difficult. The walls were thick, the doors were heavy, and guards patrolled the castle grounds day and night. But human determination can sometimes produce surprising outcomes. In a few historical accounts, prisoners managed to loosen stones in the wall. Others carefully weakened iron bars over long periods of time. Some even convinced sympathetic guards to help them. These stories were rare, but they remind us that even in the darkest places, hope sometimes remained alive. Yet most prisoners did not attempt escape. The risks were simply too great. Instead, they waited patiently for their fate to unfold. And sometimes, fate arrived in unexpected ways. Perhaps a new lord took control of the castle. Perhaps a royal messenger arrived with orders. Perhaps a witness appeared who changed the outcome of the trial. When such events occurred, the quiet routine of the dungeon could suddenly change. One afternoon, the prisoner might hear unfamiliar voices in the corridor. Strangers speaking with the guards. Keys clinking together. Then the heavy footsteps approached the cell door. The lock turned slowly. And after weeks or months of darkness, the door opened. The sudden light from the corridor felt almost blinding. The guard stood there holding a torch. Behind him stood another figure. A clerk. Or perhaps an officer of the castle. The prisoner blinked carefully. Their eyes struggled to adjust. Then the guard spoke a few simple words. "Come with us." For the prisoner, those words could mean many things. Another questioning. A trial. A transfer to another cell. Or perhaps something entirely different. They stood slowly, muscles stiff from long periods of sitting. The chains were removed or loosened, and step by step, they walked toward the staircase leading upward. Every step away from the dungeon felt strange. The air changed slightly. It became warmer, less damp. Faint daylight appeared further up the stairs. For someone who had not seen the sky in many weeks, that pale light could feel almost magical. At the top of the staircase, the prisoner stepped once again into the world above. A world that had continued without them. The castle corridors were busy. Servants moved quickly through the halls. Guards spoke quietly with one another. Life seemed normal. Yet for the prisoner, everything felt new again. Even the sound of footsteps on stone seemed louder. Even the smell of fresh air felt unfamiliar. Because time inside the dungeon had slowed the world to a quiet whisper. And now, all the sounds of life returned at once. But what awaited the prisoner next? That was a story still unfolding. For some, freedom waited just beyond the castle gates. For others, a different chapter of medieval justice was about to begin. And as the sun slowly moved across the sky outside the castle walls, the prisoner followed the guards down a long stone hallway, not knowing exactly where they were being taken, only knowing that their time in the silent dungeon had finally paused. For now, the long stone hallway stretched quietly ahead. The prisoner followed the guards at a slow and careful pace. After so much time in the darkness below, even this dim corridor felt bright. Small windows high in the castle wall allowed thin lines of daylight to enter. Dust drifted gently through those pale beams of light. For a moment, the prisoner simply watched the dust floating through the air. Such a simple sight. Yet after weeks or months underground, it felt strangely beautiful. The guards did not hurry. Medieval castles were large and often confusing places. Corridors twisted in different directions. Staircases climbed toward towers or descended again toward storage rooms. Servants passed occasionally, carrying baskets of bread or wooden buckets of water. Most of them barely glanced at the prisoner. Life inside the castle continued in its ordinary rhythm. And for the prisoner, this quiet walk through the halls felt almost unreal. Because not long ago, they had believed they might never see these parts of the castle again. Eventually the guards stopped beside a heavy wooden door. One of them knocked gently. A voice answered from inside. The door opened slowly. Within the chamber sat a clerk at a wooden table. Scrolls of parchment lay neatly arranged in front of him. Beside him stood another man dressed in the modest robes of a castle official. The prisoner was guided inside. The door closed behind them with a soft thud. For a few moments, no one spoke. The clerk dipped his feather quill into ink. Then he began writing quietly across the parchment. The scratching sound of the pen echoed softly in the small room. Finally, the official looked up. His voice was calm. Not angry. Not threatening. Simply calm. He began asking questions. The prisoner's name. Their village. The reason they had been brought to the castle. Some prisoners answered nervously. Others spoke slowly and carefully. Because words mattered greatly in medieval justice. A single sentence could sometimes change the direction of a trial. Witnesses had already given their stories. Accusations had already been written down. Now the prisoner's voice joined those records. The clerk continued writing everything carefully. Each word captured in dark ink upon the parchment. When the questions ended, the official leaned back slightly in his chair. He studied the prisoner for a moment. Then he spoke quietly with the guards. Their conversation was brief. A few nods. A few quiet words. Then the decision was made. Sometimes the outcome of such meetings surprised everyone. A prisoner might be released. Perhaps the accusations had been exaggerated. Perhaps new information had appeared. Perhaps the lord of the castle simply chose mercy. If that happened, the guard removed the remaining shackles. The prisoner was escorted through the castle gate. And suddenly, the open world waited outside. For someone who had lived in darkness for many weeks, stepping into sunlight again felt overwhelming. The sky seemed wider than they remembered. The wind felt stronger. Even the smell of grass and soil carried unfamiliar richness. Many former prisoners simply stood still for a moment, taking slow breaths, allowing their eyes to adjust, feeling the warmth of sunlight across their face. It was a quiet reminder that freedom could sometimes return in unexpected ways. But not every prisoner experienced such a moment. Some were returned to the dungeon. Others were transferred to different forms of confinement. Medieval castles contained many hidden rooms. Some prisoners were placed in small tower chambers. Others remained beneath the castle in deeper underground cells. The nature of imprisonment depended on the crime, the political situation, and sometimes simply the mood of the ruling lord. Yet even those who remained in prison found small ways to survive the passing days. Human beings are remarkably resilient. Even in difficult places, they create routines. A prisoner might wake each day when the first footsteps echoed through the dungeon corridor. They listened carefully to the sounds of the guards beginning their rounds. Later came the small meal delivered through the door. Perhaps bread. Perhaps thin soup. Perhaps a wooden cup of water. After eating, the prisoner returned to quiet reflection. Sometimes they spoke softly to themselves, repeating stories from memory, reciting prayers, or remembering songs from their village. Songs were especially powerful. Music lives deeply within memory. Even in silence, the mind can recall melodies heard long ago. Some prisoners quietly hummed those tunes, softly enough that the guards would not complain, but clearly enough that the sound filled the lonely chamber. These small rituals helped keep the mind active, because without them, time inside the dungeon could become overwhelming. Yet occasionally, something unusual happened. A new prisoner arrived. The sound of chains echoing down the corridor signaled their approach. Guards unlocked another nearby cell. The heavy door slammed shut. And suddenly, a new voice existed somewhere within the dungeon. At first there might be silence. Both prisoners waited cautiously, unsure whether speaking would be safe. But eventually, curiosity often overcame hesitation. A quiet voice drifted through the darkness. "Who are you?" The question echoed softly through the corridor. And slowly, a conversation began. Prisoners shared their stories. Where they had come from. What had happened to them. how long they had already been inside the dungeon. Sometimes these conversations lasted many nights. Two strangers, separated by stone walls, yet connected through the shared experience of waiting. In this way, even the dark halls beneath a medieval castle contained small sparks of human connection. Friendships formed through voices alone. Stories were exchanged. Memories were preserved. And through those quiet conversations, the dungeon felt slightly less lonely. Above them, the castle continued its endless cycle of daily life. Morning bells rang across the courtyard. Merchants arrived with wagons of supplies. Knights practiced with swords in the training yard. Seasons passed quietly outside the thick stone walls. Spring brought green fields across the countryside. Summer warmed the castle towers. Autumn winds carried falling leaves along the roads. Winter snows settled gently on the rooftops. But deep below, the dungeon remained almost unchanged. Cold stone, flickering torches, and the slow, steady rhythm of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Yet even in such stillness, time never truly stopped. The world above continued moving forward. Kings rose and fell. Wars ended. New rulers claimed old castles. And sometimes, those changes reached even the forgotten chambers below. One day, a new lord might arrive to take control of the castle. He would inspect the towers, examine the walls, and eventually explore the dungeon. It was during these moments that long-forgotten prisoners were sometimes rediscovered. A guard might open a door rarely used. Torchlight entered a chamber that had been dark for years. And there, a prisoner still waited. Older now, weaker perhaps, but still alive. These rare moments of rediscovery became part of medieval legend. Stories passed quietly through villages. Stories of prisoners who survived incredible lengths of time beneath ancient castles. Stories that reminded people how unpredictable history could be. And so the quiet life of the dungeon continued. Some prisoners left. Some remained. But all of them became part of the silent history hidden beneath the stone foundations of medieval castles. The medieval world was a place of great beauty and great hardship. Towering castles stood proudly above the countryside, their stone walls glowing softly in the light of the setting sun, flags moving slowly in the wind. But deep below those strong walls, far beneath the busy halls and bright fireplaces, another world existed. A quieter world. A colder world. A world where time moved very slowly. Narrow staircases twisted downward into the darkness. The air grew cooler with every step. The sounds of laughter and conversation from the castle above slowly faded away. Until at last, there was only silence. And somewhere in that darkness, a prisoner once sat quietly, listening to the steady drip of water falling from the ceiling, listening for footsteps that might never come. Now, as our story slowly fades into the quiet night, you can allow your mind to drift away from the cold dungeon walls. Imagine instead the peaceful countryside surrounding the castle. Soft wind moving across wide green fields. The distant hoot of an owl echoing through the trees. The calm rhythm of a world slowly falling asleep. And perhaps, just like the quiet villages of the medieval past, it is time for rest. So close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let the long echoes of history gently fade into silence. Good night. But before the night becomes completely quiet, let us wander just a little longer through the gentle shadows of history. Because even in those harsh medieval times, life outside the castle walls could be surprisingly peaceful, far away from the dark prisons below the stone towers. Small villages rested quietly beneath the stars. Simple wooden houses stood close together along narrow dirt paths. Thin trails of smoke drifted slowly from the chimneys. Inside those homes, families were finishing their evening meals. A pot of stew warmed gently over the fire. Bread rested on wooden tables worn smooth by many years of use. Children yawned sleepily as the day slowly came to an end. Outside, The night air carried the scent of grass and damp soil. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. The stars above the medieval countryside were bright and clear, without the glow of modern cities. The night sky seemed endless. Villagers often stepped outside their homes for a moment before sleeping, looking up quietly at the stars. For them, those distant lights in the sky were mysterious and beautiful. They did not know about galaxies or planets, but they understood something very simple. The world was vast, and their small village, resting peacefully beside the dark forest, was only a tiny part of it. As the night deepened, most of the village slowly drifted into sleep. The fires inside the houses burned lower. Doors were closed against the cool night air. Only a few quiet sounds remained. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the gentle creaking of wooden beams, and the distant flow of a small river passing through the fields. Life in medieval villages could be difficult during the day. Farmers worked long hours in the fields. Blacksmiths hammered iron in hot workshops. Bakers woke before sunrise to prepare bread for the town. But the night brought peace. A soft pause between the labors of yesterday and the work waiting for tomorrow. Even the great castles seemed calmer at night. Torches flickered along the stone walls. Guards walked slowly along the towers, their footsteps echoing quietly across the courtyard. From the outside, a castle might look powerful and unbreakable. But inside, it was simply another place where people lived their lives. Servants finished cleaning the great hall. The last candles were blown out. And somewhere high above the ground, the lord of the castle might sit quietly beside a fire, perhaps reading a letter, perhaps staring into the flames, thinking about distant lands or old memories. In many ways, their nights were not so different from ours. A moment of quiet reflection before sleep, a chance to breathe slowly, and allow the mind to rest. If you were walking along the medieval road outside the castle, you might hear the faint sound of music drifting through the air. Sometimes travelers stopped at small roadside inns. Inside those warm wooden buildings, a few people might still be awake. A lute player gently plucked a slow melody. A traveler shared stories of distant towns. But even those sounds were soft and calm, because everyone knew that morning would arrive early. Eventually, the music stopped. The candles burned lower. And one by one, the travelers climbed the creaking wooden stairs to their rooms. The innkeeper closed the door. The fire dimmed, and the quiet countryside returned once again. Across the fields, moonlight rested gently on the grass. A narrow river reflected the silver glow of the sky. The world felt still, peaceful, and slow. In moments like these, it is easy to forget the hardships that filled the daylight hours. The long work in the fields, the worries about harvests and weather. For a short while, the medieval world simply slept. And centuries later, when we imagine that distant time, it is often these quiet moments that feel closest to us. Because no matter how much the world changes, night remains the same. The wind still moves softly through the trees. The stars still glow in the sky. And somewhere, in a quiet place far away from noise and worry, someone is slowly drifting into sleep. Just as villagers once did hundreds of years ago. So take another slow breath. Let your thoughts move gently like clouds passing across the moon. There is no hurry, no rush. Only the calm rhythm of a story continuing through the peaceful darkness of history. And as the night grows deeper, we can wander a little farther along those ancient roads. Perhaps toward another quiet village, resting beside a forest where tall oak trees have stood for centuries. The wind moves softly through their branches. Leaves whisper gently in the darkness. An owl glides silently between the trees, watching the quiet fields below. Somewhere near the edge of the forest, a narrow path leads toward a small wooden bridge. Beneath that bridge, a stream flows slowly over smooth stones. The water makes a gentle sound, A soft and steady rhythm that has not changed for hundreds of years. Travelers passing through the countryside often paused here for a moment. The cool air near the water felt refreshing after a long journey. Sometimes they sat quietly on the wooden railing of the bridge, listening to the sound of the stream. Moments like these were simple, but they were precious. Because life in the medieval world could be uncertain. Roads were long. Journeys could take many days. And yet, the peaceful beauty of the countryside remained. Rolling hills, golden fields of grain, small villages resting beneath wide open skies. Even now, if you imagine walking slowly along that quiet path, you might feel the calm of that distant time, the soft crunch of gravel beneath your feet, the cool night breeze brushing gently against your face, and above you, the endless sky filled with stars. The medieval world was not only a place of struggle and hardship. It was also a place of quiet evenings, warm fires, and peaceful nights beneath the stars. And as our long journey through history continues, the night grows deeper, and the world becomes even more calm. So let your breathing slow. Allow the peaceful rhythm of the story to carry you gently forward. Through the quiet landscapes of the past. The fields grow still. The villages sleep. And the long road through history continues softly into the night. The road through the countryside stretches quietly ahead. Moonlight rests gently across the fields. And the night feels calm, almost timeless. If you were walking along that narrow medieval road, slowly and without hurry, you might begin to notice the small details that often go unseen during the busy daylight hours. The soft rustle of tall grass moving in the wind, the faint shimmer of dew beginning to settle on the leaves, and the distant silhouette of the castle still standing watch over the valley. Even from far away, its towers remain visible, dark shapes against the silver sky. During the day those walls represented power and authority. But at night, they seem quieter, almost peaceful. The guards continue their slow patrol along the towers. A torch glows softly in the distance. Its warm light flickers gently against the stone. Inside the castle, nearly everyone is asleep now. The great hall is silent. The long tables where nobles once gathered for meals now sit empty. Wooden benches rest quietly beneath the tall beams of the ceiling. The fire in the great hearth has burned low, leaving only glowing embers behind. A faint warmth still lingers in the air. Somewhere down a long corridor, a servant finishes the final task of the evening. A candle is extinguished. A wooden door closes softly. And once again the castle settles into stillness. But beneath the stone floors, deep below the quiet halls, the dungeon remains unchanged. Cold, silent, patient. The torches there burn slowly through the night, their flames moving gently as the cool underground air drifts through the passageways. Water continues to drip steadily from the stone ceiling. Drop, after drop, after drop. For a prisoner who has lived there long enough, these sounds become familiar companions. The rhythm of dripping water almost replaces the ticking of a clock. Each echo reminding them that time, even in darkness, continues to move forward. Sometimes a prisoner sits quietly against the wall, simply listening. Listening to the slow breath of the underground world. Listening to the distant creak of wood somewhere above. The human mind has an interesting way of adapting to such places. At first the silence can feel overwhelming. But slowly, very slowly, it becomes something else. A kind of quiet background. A soft emptiness where thoughts can wander freely. Some prisoners spent long hours remembering the world outside. They pictured fields glowing under the summer sun. They imagined walking along village paths again. They remembered the laughter of friends, the warmth of family gatherings, the simple comfort of sitting beside a fire. Memories like these were powerful. They helped keep hope alive. Because hope, even a small amount of it, could make the long days more bearable. And occasionally, hope proved correct. Sometimes a guard would appear unexpectedly. The heavy door creaked open. Torchlight filled the small chamber. The prisoners shielded their eyes from the sudden brightness. Then came the sound of keys, and the quiet voice of a guard. "Come with me." Moments like that could change everything. A prisoner might be called to answer new questions. They might be moved to another cell. Or, in rare and fortunate cases, they might be told they were free. But such moments were unpredictable. They arrived without warning. And until they did, the prisoners simply waited. Meanwhile, above the dungeon, the medieval countryside continued its slow rhythm of life. Morning would eventually arrive. The first faint light would appear along the eastern horizon. Roosters would begin to crow in the village. Farmers would rise early from their beds. Wooden doors would open as people stepped outside to greet the new day. Smoke would begin rising again from cottage chimneys. The scent of fresh bread might drift quietly along the narrow streets. Blacksmiths would light their forges. The ringing of iron against iron would echo through the village square. Merchants would prepare their carts. Travelers would set out once more along the dusty roads. Life continued, just as it always had. Most people rarely thought about the prisoners beneath the castle. The dungeon was simply part of the world they lived in. A place hidden away, rarely seen, and rarely discussed. Yet its presence remained quietly beneath the stone foundations. A reminder of the strict rules that governed medieval life. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the countryside would become warm and bright. Golden fields stretched across the valley. Farmers worked slowly among rows of grain. Birds moved through the trees along the edges of the forest. Children played near the small village stream. Their laughter carried lightly through the air. The medieval world was not only a place of hardship. It was also filled with ordinary moments of peace. Simple joys. Quiet routines. People working, resting, and living their lives beneath the same sky that we see today. And as evening eventually returned once more, the same calm pattern repeated. The sun drifted toward the horizon. Shadows grew longer across the fields. Farmers returned home after a long day's work. Lanterns were lit inside village houses. The soft glow of candlelight appeared in the castle windows. And once again, night slowly settled across the countryside. From the highest tower of the castle, a guard might pause for a moment during his patrol. He would look out across the valley. The quiet villages. The distant forests. The winding road disappearing into the hills. Everything seemed calm. Peaceful. Unchanging. But deep below, far beneath the stone floors, the dungeon remained exactly as it had been the night before. Torches flickered softly. Cold air moved through the corridors. And somewhere in that darkness, a prisoner might still be awake. Listening. Waiting. Hoping. Not knowing what tomorrow might bring. And yet, even in that quiet uncertainty, time continued to move forward. Because history never truly stands still. Castles age. Kings change. Wars come and go. And eventually, even the strongest stone walls become part of the distant past. Centuries later, travelers might walk through the ruins of those very castles. They might climb the worn staircases. They might stand on the old towers, looking out across the same countryside. Birds circle overhead. Grass grows where soldiers once stood guard. The wind moves gently through empty windows. And if those travelers wander far enough, they might find the old dungeon stairs. A narrow passage descending into the earth. Cool air rising slowly from the darkness below. Few visitors stay there long. The underground chambers feel quiet, almost mysterious. But those silent rooms hold stories that stretch far into the past. Stories of prisoners who waited patiently in the darkness. Stories of guards walking their nightly rounds. Stories of lives that unfolded quietly beneath the stone foundations of history. And as our journey through this calm medieval night continues, the world grows softer, quieter. The countryside sleeps beneath the stars. The wind moves gently across the fields. And somewhere in the distance, an owl calls once more through the darkness. So take another slow breath. Allow the quiet rhythm of this ancient world to carry your thoughts gently forward. The long road through history continues, calm and peaceful, beneath the silent sky. The night grows deeper now. The stars drift slowly across the sky above the quiet valley, and the long medieval road continues its silent path between the fields. If someone were walking along that road at this very moment, they might feel the calm weight of the ancient world surrounding them. No loud machines, no bright city lights, only the natural rhythm of wind, trees, and distant wildlife. The moon hangs high above the countryside. Its pale silver light spreads gently across the land. Stone walls glow faintly. Fields shimmer softly with dew, and the narrow river that winds through the valley reflects the quiet sky like a sheet of dark glass. Somewhere near the riverbank, a small wooden watermill stands beside the flowing current. During the daytime, the mill is full of life. The steady turning of its wheel, the grinding of grain inside, the voices of villagers bringing sacks of wheat to be milled. But now, in the deep hours of night, the mill rests. The wheel turns slowly, moved only by the gentle push of the water. Wood creaks softly as it rotates. A peaceful sound. A slow rhythm. Almost like a quiet lullaby carried by the river. Nearby, a small cottage sits beneath a cluster of old trees. Inside, the miller and his family sleep peacefully. The warmth of their fireplace still lingers in the room. A lantern sits dark upon the wooden table. The soft breathing of sleep fills the quiet cottage. Outside, the wind moves gently through the leaves. Branches sway slowly against the starlit sky. And high above, the moon continues its patient journey. Back at the castle, the night watch remains awake. Guards walk along the stone walls, their footsteps steady and calm. They are used to these silent hours. For them, the quiet darkness is simply part of their duty. A guard pauses near one of the tall towers. He rests his hands on the cold stone edge and looks out across the valley. From this height, the world seems peaceful. The villages appear like small clusters of shadows. A few distant lanterns glow faintly in cottage windows, and the winding road stretches across the land like a pale ribbon beneath the moon. The guard listens carefully. But nothing unusual disturbs the night. Only the distant hoot of an owl. The whisper of wind across the fields. Satisfied that all is calm, he continues his slow patrol along the wall. His torch flickers softly beside him. The flame bends gently in the breeze. And far below the castle towers, the dungeon remains unchanged. Deep beneath the stone, the cool underground chambers sit in darkness. Torchlight dances along the rough walls. The narrow corridor stretches quietly into shadow. Water drips slowly from the ceiling. Drop. Pause. Drop. For someone sitting in one of the cells, time feels different down here. Without the sun or sky, the hours lose their meaning. Only the soft flicker of torches marks the passing of the night. Perhaps a prisoner sits quietly on the wooden bench inside their cell. Their eyes closed. Their breathing slow. They listen carefully to the sounds around them. The dripping water. The distant crackle of torch flames. The faint echo of footsteps from a guard somewhere along the corridor. Even the smallest sound becomes noticeable in such silence. And slowly, their mind begins to wander. They remember the outside world. The feel of sunlight on warm stone walls. The scent of fresh bread in village streets. The bright colors of market stalls on busy mornings. These memories feel distant now, almost like dreams. Yet they remain clear inside the mind. Because memory is powerful. It allows a person to travel far beyond the walls that surround them. Even in the deepest dungeon, the imagination can still roam freely across forests, rivers, and open fields. And so the prisoner waits quietly. Not in panic. Not in anger. But in calm patience. Because sometimes, patience was the only thing a prisoner could control. Above them, life continues. The castle sleeps. The villages rest. And the countryside breathes softly beneath the stars. Far away, along another stretch of road, a lone traveler moves slowly through the night. His horse walks at a gentle pace. The sound of hooves tapping softly against the packed earth. The traveler pulls his cloak closer around his shoulders. The night air is cool, but peaceful. Traveling at night during medieval times was uncommon, but not impossible. Merchants sometimes traveled long distances between towns. Messengers carried important letters from castle to castle. Pilgrims walked long roads in search of sacred places. And sometimes, travelers simply enjoyed the quiet safety of moonlit roads. The traveler pauses for a moment beside a small hill. From here, he can see the castle rising above the valley. Its towers stand tall against the sky. Torchlights glow along the walls. The sight offers reassurance. Castles often served as safe landmarks for those moving through unfamiliar lands. The traveler watches quietly for a moment. Then he gently nudges his horse forward again. The road continues, and the peaceful countryside stretches endlessly beneath the quiet night. Back near the village, a dog lifts its head briefly as the wind shifts. It listens for a moment, then settles down again beside the cottage door. Everything remains calm. Everything remains still. The medieval world slowly sleeps beneath the quiet blanket of night. And time moves forward, softly, without hurry. If you imagine yourself there, walking through that peaceful countryside, you might begin to feel the calm rhythm of the night around you. Your steps slow. Your breathing becomes steady. The soft sounds of wind and distant water create a gentle background, almost like nature itself is guiding you toward rest. And just as the people of that ancient world eventually closed their eyes after a long day, you too can allow your thoughts to drift more slowly. The castle towers grow distant. The roads fade into quiet shadow. The fields stretch endlessly beneath the moon. And the long echoes of history continue to whisper softly through the night. The night continues to unfold quietly across the medieval countryside. The moon now begins its slow journey toward the western horizon. Its light grows softer, more gentle, spreading across the valley like a pale blanket of silver. The world feels deeply calm now. Most people in the villages have long since fallen into a peaceful sleep. Inside the small cottages, wooden beams creak quietly as the cool night air moves through narrow windows. Fireplaces have faded to warm embers. The faint glow of red coals rests softly inside the hearths. Occasionally a piece of wood shifts slightly, sending a small spark drifting upward before fading away. The families sleeping nearby barely stir. Their dreams carry them far from the quiet cottages, into places only the mind can travel. Outside, the village paths are empty. The dirt roads that were busy earlier in the day now lie silent beneath the moon. A wooden cart sits beside a stable. The horse inside shifts gently in the straw, then settles again. Somewhere in the distance, a small stream flows quietly through the grass. Its water glides smoothly over smooth stones, creating a soft sound that blends perfectly with the peaceful night. If someone were standing beside that stream right now, they might feel the cool mist rising from the water. They might notice the reflection of the moon trembling gently on the surface. And perhaps they would pause for a moment, simply listening to the calm rhythm of nature. The medieval world was deeply connected to these simple natural sounds. Without the noise of modern cities, the wind and water carried great importance. People grew used to hearing the whisper of trees, the hum of insects, the distant call of animals during the night. These sounds were not frightening. They were familiar, comforting. But beneath all of this calm life above, the dungeon continues its quiet existence. Deep underground, the air remains cool and heavy. Torchlight flickers along narrow corridors carved from thick stone. The walls hold centuries of quiet stories. Footsteps echo slowly as a guard walks through the passage. His lantern swings gently beside him. Light moves across the iron bars of each cell. Most prisoners sleep. Some lie curled beneath thin blankets. Others sit quietly against the wall, eyes closed, resting their minds. One prisoner lifts his head as the guard passes. For a brief moment their eyes meet through the bars. Neither speaks. The guard continues walking. His footsteps fade slowly down the corridor. And silence returns once again. For prisoners, the night is often the calmest time. The busy sounds of the castle disappear. Interrogations pause. Voices grow quiet. leaving only the peaceful rhythm of dripping water and flickering torches. In this silence, thoughts become clearer. Memories return. Some prisoners remember their childhood homes. Small villages surrounded by farmland. Parents working in the fields. Brothers and sisters playing beside small rivers. Others remember journeys they once took across distant lands. Markets filled with bright colors. Ships resting in crowded harbors. Busy cities with towering stone cathedrals. The mind travels easily during long, quiet nights. And sometimes, those memories bring comfort. Even in the darkest places, the past can shine like a small lantern inside the mind. Hours pass slowly. The moon continues its steady path across the sky. Eventually, the first faint signs of morning begin to appear far beyond the hills. It is still night, but the deepest darkness begins to soften. The stars fade slightly. The cool air shifts. In the village, the dog beside the cottage door lifts its head again. Somewhere in the trees, an owl makes its final call before returning to rest. Night creatures slowly retreat to their hidden shelters. And far out in the fields, the earliest birds begin to stir among the branches. Back at the castle tower, the guard notices the subtle change in the sky. He has watched this moment many times before. The quiet transition between night and morning. It arrives gently, almost unnoticed. He stretches his shoulders slightly and continues walking along the wall. Soon, the next shift of guards will arrive. Soon, the castle will begin to wake. But for now, the world still rests in the final peaceful moments of night. If you imagine yourself standing there, breathing the cool morning air, you might feel an incredible calm. The valley stretches endlessly before you. The stars slowly fade. And the first pale glow of dawn begins to rise beyond the distant hills. Everything moves slowly, peacefully, just as it has for centuries. And as the medieval world prepares quietly for a new day, you too can allow your mind to grow calm and heavy. The quiet countryside, the distant castle, the gentle wind across the fields, all drifting softly into peaceful silence. The first light of morning is still far away. Night holds the countryside in a deep and gentle silence. The moon now sits lower in the sky, casting a softer glow across the quiet valley. Mist begins to gather slowly above the fields. Thin strands of silver fog drift between the tall grasses. They move slowly, almost like quiet rivers floating across the land. If someone were walking along the old road now, their footsteps would sound softer than ever. The earth has cooled during the long night. Dew rests upon every blade of grass, and each step releases the faint scent of damp soil and wild plants. The medieval road curves gently around a small hill. At its base stands a weathered stone bridge. The bridge crosses a narrow river that has flowed through the valley for countless generations. During the day, carts and travelers pass across this bridge regularly. Wooden wheels rumble over the stones. Farmers guide their horses across the shallow rise. Children sometimes pause along the side, watching the water rush beneath their feet. But tonight, the bridge stands empty. Only the quiet river moves below. The water flows steadily between smooth rocks, whispering softly as it continues its endless journey toward distant lands. Mist rises from the surface. Moonlight touches the water and breaks into gentle ripples of silver. If you were standing at the center of that bridge, looking down into the slow current, you might feel the calm power of time itself. The same river flowed here hundreds of years ago. It carried rainwater from distant hills. It reflected the same stars shining above. Long before castles were built, the river was already moving through this valley. And long after the stone towers fade into ruins, it will continue to flow quietly onward. Back near the village, a faint movement stirs within one of the small cottages. Inside, an elderly baker slowly wakes from his sleep. Years of early mornings have trained his body to rise before the sun. He sits up quietly beside the dying fire. For a moment he simply listens. The house is silent. His family still sleeps peacefully in the nearby room. The baker gently adds a few small pieces of wood to the hearth. Soon the faint crackle of flame begins to grow again. Warm orange light spreads slowly across the stone walls. The smell of burning wood fills the cottage. It is a comforting scent, one that has greeted countless mornings. Soon, the baker begins his daily work. He prepares flour, water, yeast saved carefully from yesterday's batch. These simple ingredients will soon become the bread that feeds the entire village. While the dough slowly rises beside the fire, the baker steps outside for a moment. The air is cool and fresh. Mist drifts through the quiet streets. Above the rooftops, the castle towers remain visible against the fading stars. He takes a slow breath. Moments like this, before the village awakens, feel almost magical. The world belongs to silence. Only the earliest workers witness these peaceful hours. After a moment, he returns inside to continue preparing the bread. Soon the smell of fresh baking will drift through the village streets. And slowly, people will begin their day. Back at the castle, the guards on the wall continue their final rounds of the night watch. Their torches burn lower now. The flames flicker gently as the breeze grows cooler before dawn. One guard pauses near the eastern tower. From here, the horizon can be seen clearly. A faint gray glow appears far in the distance. Morning approaches, though it still feels far away. The guard leans slightly against the stone and watches quietly. These moments between night and dawn are often the calmest of all. The world seems to hold its breath. Even the wind becomes still. Far below the tower, inside the castle courtyard, a horse shifts in the stable. The animal stamps softly against the wooden floor. A stable boy sleeping nearby turns over in his blanket, then settles again. Within the castle halls, the silence remains deep. But in the kitchens, the first servants will soon begin to stir. Fires will be lit. Water will be drawn from the well. Breakfast preparations will slowly begin. Yet deep beneath all of this quiet activity, the dungeon remains unchanged. The underground corridors still glow faintly with torchlight. The same slow drip of water echoes through the stone passage. A guard carrying a lantern walks quietly along the row of cells. His boots touch the stone floor with slow, steady steps. The prisoners remain mostly silent. Some sleep. Some simply sit in stillness, waiting for the next day to unfold. One prisoner rests with his back against the wall, eyes half closed. Perhaps he senses the coming morning, even without seeing the sky. Humans often feel these small changes without realizing it. The air grows slightly different. The world above begins to move again. And somewhere deep inside, the body recognizes the turning of another day. He listens quietly. The dripping water. The fading footsteps of the guard. The distant creak of wood from somewhere high above. Then once again, silence. Time moves slowly here. But it always moves forward. Meanwhile, the mist in the valley grows thicker for a short while. The fields appear almost like a dreamlike ocean of pale clouds. Only the tops of fences and trees remain visible. The castle towers rise above the mist like distant islands, their stone walls catching the faint glow of the coming dawn. Soon, the first birds begin to wake. A single chirp echoes from a tree branch. Then another. And another. Within minutes the quiet countryside fills with gentle birdsong. Soft music welcoming the approaching sunrise. The baker inside his cottage hears the birds as well. He smiles slightly as he checks the rising dough. The day is beginning. Soon the village will wake. Soon carts will roll along the roads. Soon smoke will rise from every chimney. But for just a few more minutes, the peaceful calm of night still lingers. If you imagine yourself standing quietly in that valley now, breathing the cool morning air, you might feel a deep sense of calm spreading through your thoughts. The long night is ending. The countryside prepares for another gentle day. The castle stands watch over the land. And the ancient world continues its slow, steady rhythm, just as it has for centuries. The first light of morning finally begins to touch the horizon. It arrives very slowly, almost quietly, as if the sun itself does not wish to disturb the peaceful valley. The dark blue sky softens into pale shades of gray and silver. Stars begin to fade one by one. And the moon, which watched patiently over the countryside all night, slowly slips behind the distant hills. A cool breeze moves gently across the fields. The mist that covered the valley during the night begins to rise and drift away. Thin clouds of fog float across the grass before disappearing into the warming air. From the branches of tall trees, birds greet the new day with soft songs. Their voices echo across the open countryside. A peaceful chorus welcoming the morning. In the small village below the castle, the first signs of life appear. The baker's oven now glows brightly inside his cottage. Warm light shines through the window. The comforting smell of fresh bread drifts slowly into the quiet street. Soon villagers will wake and follow that scent toward the bakery door. Farmers begin to stir inside their homes. Wooden doors creak open. A farmer steps outside and stretches his arms beneath the pale morning sky. He looks across his fields, where dew still glitters softly on the grass. Another day of work will begin soon. But for a moment, he simply stands quietly, enjoying the calm beauty of the early morning. Near the village well, a woman arrives carrying a wooden bucket. She lowers the rope slowly into the cool water below. The bucket splashes gently. Then she pulls it back up, hand over hand, the rope sliding softly across the stone edge. These small tasks begin the rhythm of every medieval morning. Simple actions repeated day after day. Drawing water, lighting fires, preparing food, caring for animals. Life in the medieval countryside followed these steady patterns. The world moved slowly, but it moved with purpose. Above the village, the great castle also begins to wake. The guards on the towers finish their long night watch. New guards arrive to take their places. A horn sounds softly across the courtyard, announcing the start of the morning shift. Servants step into the kitchens to prepare the first meal of the day. Fires are lit. Pots are filled with water. Footsteps echo gently along the castle corridors. Windows are opened to allow fresh air inside. Morning light begins to spill across the stone floors. Even the banners hanging along the walls seem brighter in the soft, golden glow of sunrise. The castle that once seemed silent and mysterious during the night now slowly fills with life again. But deep beneath all this activity, the dungeon remains much the same. The underground chambers stay cool and dim. Torchlight still flickers against the old stone walls. The steady drip of water continues its quiet rhythm. Yet even here, the change of day can sometimes be felt. A guard walks down the narrow staircase carrying a lantern. His footsteps echo through the passage. Keys jingle softly at his side. He moves past the cells one by one, checking each door carefully. For some prisoners, morning brings uncertainty. For others, it brings quiet hope. Because every new day carries the possibility that something might change. Perhaps a message will arrive. Perhaps a trial will begin. Perhaps freedom might finally come. Or perhaps, the day will pass just like the one before it. In the medieval world, patience was often the only certainty. Time continued moving forward, one sunrise at a time. Above ground, the sun now rises fully above the distant hills. Warm golden light spreads across the countryside. The mist disappears from the fields. Birds glide through the clear morning sky. Farmers walk toward their land with tools resting on their shoulders. Children run along the village paths. The blacksmith opens the doors of his workshop. Soon the ringing sound of hammer against iron will echo across the square. Life continues, just as it has for centuries. The castle stands tall above it all, its towers glowing warmly in the sunlight. Travelers moving along the road might pause to look up at the ancient stone walls. Perhaps they wonder about the many stories hidden within those towers. The feasts, the battles, the quiet nights beneath the stars. And somewhere, deep below those walls, the silent dungeon where prisoners once waited in darkness. History holds many such stories. Some filled with hardship. Others filled with courage and patience. But as time moves forward, even the strongest castles slowly grow old. Centuries pass. Kings change. Wars end. And eventually, The busy halls of those great castles fall quiet. Today, many medieval castles stand as peaceful ruins, their stone walls softened by moss and grass. Visitors walk slowly through the old courtyards. They climb the worn towers. They explore the cool chambers beneath the ground. And sometimes, when they step into the ancient dungeon halls, they pause for a moment. The air feels cooler there. The silence feels deeper, almost as if the past still whispers quietly through the stone. Yet outside those walls, the countryside remains beautiful and calm. Fields stretch beneath wide open skies. Rivers continue their endless journey. Birds sing in the trees just as they did hundreds of years ago. Time moves forward, but nature keeps its gentle rhythm. And now, as our story slowly reaches its peaceful ending, you can let your thoughts drift away from the old castles and quiet dungeons of the medieval world. Instead, imagine the calm countryside resting beneath the morning sun. Soft wind moving across the open fields. Golden light touching the distant hills. The quiet comfort of a world slowly waking. Or perhaps, if the night has grown late where you are, imagine the peaceful moment just before sleep. A calm breath. A quiet room. The gentle feeling of rest slowly arriving. History has many echoes, but tonight they fade softly into silence. The castle stands quietly in the distance. The roads stretch peacefully across the land. And the long stories of the medieval world drift gently away, like mist disappearing beneath the rising sun. So close your eyes. Take one slow, calm breath. And allow the quiet echoes of history to settle peacefully in the distance. Good night, Crescent Moon.